The catapult took Lieutenant Talia Reyes' spine and slammed it through the back of her seat, and the number on her canopy display was already counting down from 5 hours, 57 minutes, 40 seconds when her interceptor cleared the tube. She did not look at it twice. She had trained for 9 years not to look at clocks twice. Behind her, across the dark curve of Earth, 31 catapults on 11 ships fired in the same 11 seconds, and 31 more fighters went out into a night that had been quiet by treaty for 22 years. Ahead of her, past the orbital picket and the long cold nothing beyond it, a relay tower the size of a cathedral turned slowly against the stars, blinking its running lights the way it had blinked them every night of her life, patient, imperial, certain that tonight was like every other night. It was not. 4 minutes earlier, in a hardened room under the Rockies that had not existed on any public map since before Talia was born, First Speaker Cray had looked at a live feed from Corvale Station, grain silos, a schoolhouse, a water tower with her own family's name painted under someone else's, 20 years ago, in defiance of an order to paint it over, and had said 4 words into an open channel: execute the Longview Doctrine. Fleet Admiral Osgood Hale, 61 years old, the only man in that room who remembered exactly what 4 words like that had cost the last time humanity used them, had not asked her to repeat herself. He had simply turned to the officer beside him and said, "Launch." That was the order Talia's canopy had translated into the shove of the catapult, and the number now falling past 5 hours, 56 minutes on her display. Not a countdown to a deadline, a countdown to a promise. She did not know yet exactly what the number meant. She would learn in pieces over the next 5 hours, the way everyone in the fleet would learn it, not as a plan explained to them in a briefing room, because a plan like this had never been explained to anyone in full, not even to her. She only knew her piece of it: hit the relay, blind the sky, and get back alive to fly the second sortie, because there would be a second sortie and a third, until Corvale's water tower stopped being somebody else's to paint. 600 kilometers away and a lifetime out of reach, her brother Mateo was 14 years old, and he had exactly 5 hours and 56 minutes left to live, unless the plan her whole life had apparently been quietly built around actually worked. She put the relay tower in her sights and did not think about that again, because thinking about it would kill her, and dying would not save him. Fireline Squadron flew a loose diamond that HFY had drilled into them for 3 years without ever explaining why the pattern mattered, because the pattern had been designed in a simulator vault under the Rockies, specifically for a relay tower that fewer than a dozen cleared officers had ever been told existed. Petty Officer Grace Ape held the 4 slot, 22 years old, 2 years out of flight school, humming something tuneless over an open channel out of a nervousness she would have denied having if anyone had asked. Ensign Marcus Kessler held 3, a decade older than the rest of them, a former merchant pilot who had volunteered for military service the week his daughter turned 12 being, in the Wardenry's compliance schedules, the age at which tribute claims began. None of them had been told, in so many words, that tonight was the night. They had been told for 3 years to keep their gear staged and their affairs quiet and to trust that when the order finally came it would come without warning, because warning was the one thing Longview's planners had decided, after Meridian, could never be allowed to reach the Compliance Accord's listening network first. 22 years of a species learning to keep a secret from an empire that read everyone's mail had taught Earth exactly one lesson worth teaching twice. Silence, held long enough and evenly enough, looked identical to defeat, right up until it wasn't. The relay tower grew from a point of light to a shape to a cathedral of dark hull plating in under 4 minutes, its running lights blinking the unhurried rhythm of a structure that had never once needed to hurry. HFY's voice came flat and even over the channel, the same voice he used to call a training exercise. Fireline, arm penetrators. On my mark, we make this the loudest quiet night in 22 years. Talia armed hers without needing to check the display. Her hands remembered the sequence the way they remembered breathing. She thought, for exactly as long as she allowed herself to think about anything that was not the tower ahead of her father's memorial photograph. The one Fleet Command had quietly ordered removed from the squadron ready room 11 years earlier, because a dead man in a flight suit made visiting liaison officers uncomfortable, and the one Akafor had rehung, in a different frame, in a different corner, the week those officers stopped visiting at all. Daniel Reyes had died at Meridian trying to get 11 children onto a transport that lifted 4 seconds too late for 3 of them. He had never lived to know his daughter would grow up to fly the mission built, in no small part, to make sure no father ever had to make that choice again. Then the tower filled her canopy, and there was no more room in her for anything but the work. The ultimatum had gone out 11 minutes before that, over every channel Earth still permitted the occupying powers to use. Warden-Commandant Talia Draeth of the Cindral Wardenry, a narrow, patient officer who had built a 20-year career on never once raising his voice, had stood in the command spire above Corvale Station and read a compliance notice into a recorder the way he had read 400 compliance notices before it. Corvale had missed its tribute quota for the 3rd consecutive quarter. Corvale's administrators had failed again to produce the labor manifest the Wardenry required. And Corvale, per the standing terms of the compliance accord, would now furnish that labor directly, every resident between the ages of 12 and 50, remanded to the Wardenry's mine consortium, with those unsuited to productive tribute processed under Compliance Directive 9, effective in 6 hours, whether or not the manifest was ever produced at all. Draeth had joined the Wardenry as a compliance auditor 20 years earlier, in the years immediately following Meridian, when the newly signed compliance accord still needed officers willing to enforce terms that even some of the throne's own negotiators had privately considered excessive. He had never seen the massacre itself. Meridian had been a Dominion fleet operation, not a Wardenry one, but he had studied its outcome with the close, professional attention of a man taking notes on a method that worked. A single overwhelming demonstration, applied once, decisively, against a world that had resisted a tribute demand, had bought the Empire 2 decades of unbroken compliance from every human world that heard about it afterward. He did not consider this cruelty. He considered it, in the specific vocabulary of his training, efficiency. A single terrible cost paid early, to avoid 1,000 smaller costs paid slowly forever. What Draeth had never bothered to calculate, what none of the compliance accord's architects had ever bothered to calculate, in 140 years of refining the arithmetic of fear, was what would happen the day a demonstration failed to produce the compliance it was designed to produce. Meridian had taught the throne that overwhelming force, applied once, worked. It had never once occurred to anyone drafting policy from that lesson that Meridian might also have taught the survivors something else, that the only way to make sure it never happened again was to become, eventually, in patient and total secret, a species the throne could no longer afford to make an example of. He had not expected an answer. In 22 years, no human authority had ever answered a compliance notice with anything but the manifest. He got an answer 4 minutes later, and it was not the manifest. It was First Speaker Cray's voice, unencrypted, broadcast on the same channel Draeth had used, audible to every listening post and picket ship and administrative office in what the Korrathi Imperium's charts called the Meridian Reach, named, with the tidy cruelty of an empire that filed its atrocities under geography. After the human colony world, it had erased 22 years earlier to teach the rest of the Reach the price of resistance. Warden-Commandant Draeth, Cray said, in a voice that did not shake, Corvale Station will not be furnishing your manifest. Neither will any other compact world, today or on any day after today. You gave us 22 years to learn what a demonstration costs. We spent them well. You have 6 hours before your directive takes effect. We intend to use every one of them." She had already given the order to hail before she finished the sentence. That was the part that would trouble the Empire's historians for a generation. That Earth had not deliberated. Earth had answered in the time it took to speak 41 words, because the deliberation had already happened in secret for 22 years, and there was nothing left to decide. The relay tower's first warning of trouble was a maintenance drone reporting an unscheduled EVA contact at 0341 local. Its second warning was the maintenance drone going silent. Its third warning was Talia Reyes' wingtip flashing past its outer hull at 11,000 kilometers an hour with 4 hardened penetrator charges already falling free behind her, tumbling end over end toward the relay's primary transmitter array, with the lazy patience of objects that did not need to hurry because nothing was going to stop them. The array had processed, on an average night, 40 million discrete data packets, tribute manifests, patrol schedules, compliance notices, the endless bureaucratic weather of an empire that ran on paperwork as much as it ran on warships. Tonight it processed one more transmission before the charges hit, an automated distress flag, unencrypted, blaring on every frequency the Cindral Wardenry, the Tribute Concord, and the Dominion fleet all monitored separately. Because the compliance accord that governed the Meridian reach had been drafted 140 years earlier, by an empire more worried about its own vassal factions colluding against the throne than about anything a single unarmed species could ever do to any one of them. The charges hit. The array did not finish the transmission. For the next 4 hours and 11 minutes, no message would travel between the Dominion fleet, the Tribute Concord, and the Cindral Wardenry inside the Meridian reach that Earth's own hijacked relay network did not choose to let through. And Earth's relay network, from the first second, chose to let through almost nothing at all. Talia rolled her fighter hard around the tower's dying bulk, felt the shockwave from the last penetrator charge slap her hull like a flat hand, and keyed her comm. "Fireline lead, Fireline 2. Relays down, I say again, relays down." "Copy 2. Captain Idris Akafar's voice was flat and calm, the voice of a man twice her age who had spent 19 years teaching new pilots that calm was a discipline, not a feeling. "Command copies. Form up on me. We have 30 seconds before the picket wakes up angry, and I intend to be somewhere else by then." They were not somewhere else in 30 seconds. The Dominion fleet's forward picket 6 escort cruisers under a young flotilla officer who had never fired his weapons in anger in 11 years of a career built entirely on garrison duty, woke up in 9. Fleet Marshal Res Oduin received the first fragmentary report of contact at 0344 local Meridian reach time, standing on the command deck of the Dominion cruiser Ashgard's Word, 40,000 kilometers coreward of Earth, where his blockade fleet had held station, unbothered and unbroken, for 2 decades. He had commanded that blockade for 6 years. In that time he had watched, with the mild, professional contempt of a man who had personally subdued 3 uprisings on 3 different worlds, as human freighters queued patiently at his checkpoints, as human administrators filed their manifests on schedule, as an entire species that his tacticians described in briefing after briefing as structurally incapable of coordinated large-scale resistance, went on quietly building the small, orderly, defeated life the compliance accord had assigned it. "Contact report," his tactical officer said. 6 vessels, escort cruiser signature, contact lost. "Contact lost how?" "Destroyed, Marshal, all 6. Simultaneous." Oduin turned from the viewport, and for the first time in 6 years felt something that was not quite alarm, more like the faint, specific irritation of a man discovering an error in a ledger he had never once needed to check. 6 cruisers. Simultaneous. By what? Unknown. Fighter class contacts minimum, possibly larger. Sensors are Marshal. Sensors are reporting relay loss across the entire forward net. We cannot raise the listening posts. We cannot raise Tribute Concord administration on any of the Tribute worlds. We cannot raise the Wardenry command spire above Corvale. Raise the throne, then. Request a status confirmation from the Compliance Accord office. A pause, longer than it should have been. Marshal, we cannot raise the throne either. Oduin said nothing for 4 seconds, which for a man who had never in 6 years let a silence run past 2 was, in its own way, the first surrender of the night, though no one in that room would have called it that yet. Then he said, in the same voice he had used to order the subjugation of 3 worlds, "Bring the fleet to combat alert, all ships, and get me a count of every human vessel this system has ever registered, because whatever that was, it did not come from anything on that list." It had not. 22 of the ships now converging on his blockade line had never been on any list at all. They had been built in the Kestrel Belt, 40 million kilometers past the edge of anyone's survey charts, in a mining operation that had reported the same modest yield of ore for 19 years running while its lower levels quietly grew a shipyard. And they carried names: Longview, Meridian's Answer, Second Chance, Not Again, that no Imperial cartographer had ever logged, because no Imperial cartographer had ever been allowed to look. Longview had entered the engagement with 11 capital ships against Oduin's 23, a ratio that had looked, on paper, in 19 years of planning sessions, like the single greatest risk in the entire doctrine. The one variable no amount of buried infrastructure or sleeper resistance could fully offset, because a warship either existed or it did not, and Earth had never been permitted to build enough of them fast enough, or openly enough, to close that gap by numbers alone. Hale's planners had spent those 19 years betting instead on something the Dominion fleet's doctrine had no line item for, that a smaller force fighting with total foreknowledge of its enemy's habits, its blind spots, and its doctrine's exact failure points would trade favorably against a larger one fighting blind. It was, Talia would think later, the entire war compressed into a single wager. Not that Earth could match the Empire ship for ship, but that patience, spent correctly, was worth more than mass. The battle that followed was not, by any honest measure, easy. Talia would remember it later in fragments, the way combat always came back to her, not as a story with a beginning and a middle, but as a string of specific, ordinary-feeling moments strung across 90 unbearable minutes. The smell of ozone off her own overheating power core. Akafer's voice going tight and formal, which was how she knew he was hurt before he said so. The particular, sick lurch of watching Fireline 4's contact blink out on her display without a word on the comm to explain it, because there had been no time for a word. They lost 4 fighters out of 12 in the first engagement. Dominion point defense turned out to be faster and better coordinated than any pre-mission estimate had allowed for, and the picket line, reinforced within 11 minutes by a full third of Oduin's main battle line, moving with a speed that told its own story about how seriously the Marshal had taken unknown contacts, simultaneous, closed the gap between Earth's covert fleet and the relay wreckage faster than Longview's planners had modeled. Akafer took a hit at 04-19 that should have killed him, and instead only crippled his fighters' maneuvering thrusters, which meant he flew the next 40 minutes in a straight line with no evasive capability at all, drawing fire deliberately, twice, away from younger pilots who had never seen combat before that night. "Fireline 2, he said on a private channel at 0431, "if this doesn't hold, you get your people back to the barge. Not me. You hear me, Reyes?" "I hear you, Captain." "Say it back." "I get my people back, not you." "Good girl." A pause and something under the flatness of his voice that she recognized, because she had heard it once before at her father's memorial from men who had served with him. "Your father would have liked this fight, ugly as it is." Then a Dominion interceptor put 6 rounds through his cockpit, and Captain Idris Okafor did not answer the comm again. For 6 seconds, nobody on the channel said anything at all, and in a fight where the Dominion picket had already proven it could exploit 6 seconds of hesitation better than any tactic in Fireline's playbook, 6 seconds nearly finished what Okafor's death had started. The counterflank came from the picket's reserve element, 4 interceptors that had held position behind the main line for the entire engagement, waiting, Talia understood later, when Longview's analysts reconstructed the battle from 100 sensor logs, for exactly the kind of gap a dead flight lead left behind. They came in low and fast under Fireline's formation, angling to cut the surviving 8 fighters off from the transport barge that was their only route home, and for a long, ugly stretch of the fight, it worked. Ensign Kessler took a glancing hit that tore half his port stabilizer away and sent him tumbling out of formation, cursing steadily and without panic in a voice that told Talia he still had control, barely. Grace Ape's fighter took 2 hits in 9 seconds and kept flying only because the Dominion gunner firing on her ran out of angle before he ran out of intent. Talia had 11 seconds to decide whether Fireline's squadron lived as a formation or died as 8 separate targets, and she spent 4 of them doing the only thing 9 years of training had actually prepared her to do under that kind of pressure. She stopped thinking about what Okafor would have ordered and gave the order herself. Fireline, break high and reform on me, Vector 310. Kessler, if you can still steer your bait, draw their reserve element up and away from the barge approach, and I will put everything I have into whoever follows you. Everybody else, we buy him 9 seconds, and then we run this exact play command drilled us on in the Kestrel Belt simulator 18 times, because it worked 18 times in a room, and today is the day we find out if it works for real. Kessler didn't answer. He simply turned his crippled fighter into the reserve element's flight path, and 3 of the 4 interceptors took the bait, exactly the way the simulator had promised they would, because Dominion doctrine rewarded aggression and punished a pilot who let an obviously wounded target escape. Talia and the 4 uninjured fighters of Fireline's squadron hit those 3 interceptors from an angle the simulator had spent 18 runs teaching her to find, and killed all 3 in under 12 seconds. The 4th interceptor, smarter or simply luckier than the others, broke off toward the barge instead, and it was Grace Ape, 22 years old, 2 hits already scored on her hull, humming no longer, who put herself between it and the barge's open landing bay, and held that position under fire for the 11 seconds it took the rest of the squadron to catch up and finish it. She would tell the story, months later, at Okafor's memorial, in a voice that shook only once, at the end, when she admitted she had not expected to still be alive to tell it. Kessler limped his fighter back to the barge on manual thrust alone, alive, furious, already asking for a new stabilizer and a chance to fly the next sortie. Talia let him. She had learned in the space of 1 terrible minute exactly what Okafor had meant about calm being a discipline, that it did not mean feeling nothing, only that whatever you felt, you flew the plan anyway, and you flew it for the people who no longer could. Fleet Marshal Oduin, watching his picket line's reserve element vanish in the same engagement that had cost him 3 cruisers, and was now costing him interceptors he could not easily replace, made the decision at 04:41 that Longview's planners had spent 3 years quietly betting he would make. He committed his main battle line, all of it, 4 capital ships and their full escort screen, to crush what his tactical staff was now calling, with a confidence Oduin did not entirely share, a numerically inferior irregular force. It was, by every doctrine the Dominion fleet had ever trained him on, the correct decision. A blockade commander facing an unexpected incursion concentrated force and ended the engagement decisively, rather than bleeding out slowly across a dozen smaller actions. Oduin had made that exact call twice before, on 2 other worlds, and both times it had ended the fight within the hour. It ended this fight within the hour too, not the way he expected. The 4 capital ships of the Longview Reserve Fleet, not again, Second Chance's sister ship still standing, and 2 others whose names Longview's planners had never once transmitted on any channel the Empire could intercept, had spent 19 years disguised as ore haulers working the Kestrel Belt's outer claims, their hulls built to the exact profile of a mining vessel. Their weapons systems assembled in sealed compartments that even the crews who lived aboard them for years at a time had not been permitted to see activated until 6 hours earlier. They came out of the Belt's debris field at 0447 on a vector Dominion sensors had never once flagged as a threat corridor, because no ship of that hull class had ever been a threat before, and they hit Oduin's committed battle line from a firing angle his own doctrine manuals insisted was structurally impossible for a mining hull to achieve. It was not impossible. It had simply never been tried, because it had never occurred to the Dominion fleet's doctrine writers that an occupied species might spend 19 years building warships shaped like patience itself. Oduin's flagship took 4 hits in the engagement's opening 90 seconds, hits from weapons his own sensors had rated, 6 hours earlier, as belonging to unarmed civilian mining equipment. He understood, watching his tactical display redraw itself in real time, that he had just lost the engagement, and that he had lost it in a way no after-action report was going to let him explain away as bad luck. He had committed everything, exactly as doctrine demanded, into a trap that had been under construction since before most of his crew were born. Reserve Fleet, hold position and target only vessels that continue firing, came a voice over an open channel a moment later, not Hale's this time, but a captain named Odalis Pharaoh, who had spent 19 years pretending to haul ore and had waited every one of them for the chance to say what came next. Fleet Marshal, you have lost. You lost the moment you decided to trust doctrine written by people who had never once imagined losing. Stand down, and every one of your crew goes home. Continue, and we will finish what your own manuals told you was impossible in the first place. Oduin did not answer immediately, but he gave the order to disengage his surviving escort screen within the minute, and it was that order, not yet a formal surrender, but the first crack in 20 years of unbroken doctrine, that Longview's planners would later mark privately as the true turning point of the entire 5-hour war. Talia did not have time to grieve him. That was the part no one warned you about in 9 years of training. Not that people you loved would die, but that you would have to keep flying a combat pattern for another 11 minutes with the fact of it sitting in your chest like a stone you could not put down, because putting it down would get someone else killed too. She took the flight lead without being told to. Nobody argued. By 0452, 90 minutes into a war Earth had waited 22 years to start. 3 facts had become clear to Fleet Marshal Oduin, and none of them were facts he had any procedure for handling. The first was that the human fleet fighting his blockade line was not improvised. It fought like a fleet that had drilled this exact engagement 100 times in simulation, because it had. The second was that he could not raise anyone, not the Cindral Wardenry, not the Tribute Concord, not the throne, not even his own rear elements holding station on the far side of the system, because Earth's forces had by now seized or jammed every relay node inside the Reach methodically, in an operation that had clearly begun the instant his first cruiser died, and had not slowed down since. The third fact was the one that actually frightened him, in the specific, professional way that frightened a man who had spent 30 years being unafraid of everything else. His losses had passed 40% of committed strength, and the human fleet's losses, by his own sensor logs, had not passed 20. He had entered this engagement with every structural and numerical advantage. The compliance accord promised the Dominion fleet, and he was losing it on the numbers alone, without accounting for the fact that he still had no idea how many more ships Earth had waiting behind the ones he could see. He had one working assumption left, and it was the assumption every officer in the Meridian Reach's occupying command structure was quietly reaching, alone in the same 40 minutes, without any of them able to compare notes. That whatever this was, it was happening to him specifically, that his colleagues in the Concord and the Wardenry were untouched and unbothered, and that if he held the line another hour, relief would come from a throne that would eventually notice the silence and ask why. 40 light days away, on Korrathi Prime, none of that silence had reached the throne yet, and would not for weeks in any form heavier than rumor. The Compliance Accord's reporting chain ran through relay stations that measured news in months, not minutes, which was, historians would later note, one more assumption the throne had never thought to question. But Alice Vore, court historian and senior archivist of the Compliance Accord's provincial files, noticed something smaller and stranger that same afternoon. 3 routine administrative pings from the Meridian Reach, quarterly tribute confirmations, the dullest paperwork in the Empire's entire filing structure, simply failed to arrive on schedule, all 3, within the same reporting window, for the first time in the 140 years since the Accord had been signed. She logged the anomaly the way she logged everything, in the private journal she was technically forbidden to keep and had kept anyway for 31 years, and wrote beside it a single line she would return to weeks later when the full report finally reached the throne. 3 silences in one afternoon is not an accident. I do not yet know what it is. I intend to find out before anyone tells me the answer. She would not have to wait as long as she expected. He did not know that Overseer Prefect Yanner Seal, 40 light minutes away on the administrative world of Halcourt, was at that exact moment making the identical assumption about him. Yanner Seal had governed the Tribute Concord's occupation of 6 colony worlds for 11 years, and had done it, by his own quiet estimation, humanely. He did not care for the word cruelty, found it imprecise, preferred to think of his tribute quotas as the ordinary friction of a well-run administration. He had built on Halcourt an office of extraordinary bureaucratic elegance, manifests filed in triplicate, quotas adjusted for seasonal yield, appeals processes that occasionally, memorably, even ruled in a human petitioner's favor, all of it running with the calm, self-congratulating efficiency of a man who believed his restraint made him better than Draeth's open brutality, and who had never once had to ask himself whether restraint administered at gunpoint was restraint at all. He kept in a locked drawer of his office a ledger of his own devising that no Concord audit had ever required him to keep, a private tally of appeals he had personally approved, the humane exceptions he liked to point to when comparing himself, favorably, to Draeth's blunter methods a few worlds over. He did not keep an equivalent tally of the appeals he had denied, or the quotas he had adjusted downward for a season and never adjusted back up, or the 17-year-old dockworker from Halcourt, 4 years dead now, whose case file he could no longer specifically recall among the hundreds like it, though the boy's younger sister, loading freighters on his own docks every single day since, remembered it with a precision that had never once faded. Seal believed, with the particular sincerity of a man who has never had to test the belief against consequence, that his restraint made him fundamentally different from an officer like Draeth. He had never once considered that a population living under the threat of force does not experience the difference between a velvet hand and an iron, one nearly as clearly as the hand itself imagines it does. That 11 years of quiet, well-administered fear had taught Halcourt's dockworkers exactly the same patience, and exactly the same silence, that Draeth's cruder methods had taught Corvale, and that both silences, in the end, had been counting down toward the same afternoon all along. At 04:58 local, his office received word that 3 Tribute World garrisons, Halcourt itself, plus the mining colonies at Ashwell and Dunmore, had gone dark within the same 11-minute window. Not destroyed. Simply gone quiet, their comm officers unreachable, their perimeter sensors reporting nothing at all, as if someone had reached in and switched every listening ear off at once. He assumed at first a systems failure. Halcourt's infrastructure was old. He stopped assuming that at 05:14, when 400 human dockworkers who had loaded his tribute freighters without complaint for 11 years walked off the docks in a single coordinated column, opened a warehouse that Concord inspectors had cleared for agricultural storage 6 times in the last 3 years, and came out of it carrying rifles that Longview's planners had smuggled into that warehouse, 2 crates at a time, over the course of 9 years. Hidden inside consignments of grain that no inspector had ever thought to weigh twice. Priya Solis had spent 9 years waiting for that warehouse door to matter. She had been 10 years old when Concord auditors reclassified her family's grain allotment as a seasonal adjustment, and her older brother, 17 and furious, and unwilling to watch his sisters go hungry to make SEAL's shipping quotas balance, had been remanded to a labor detail for quota disruption, and had not survived his 2nd year there. She had not cried at the time, because crying on Halcourt was a thing Concord officers noted in their files, and she had learned early that anything an officer noted in a file eventually got used against you. She had simply gone back to loading freighters, quietly, patiently, for 9 more years, and had never once told anyone, not her mother, not her remaining sister, not even the resistance handler who eventually recruited her, how carefully she had counted every one of those years. When the warehouse door finally opened at 05:14 and 400 dockworkers walked out carrying rifles that 9 years of smuggled grain consignments had hidden 2 crates at a time, Priya Solis was the first through the compound's outer gate, and among the first to find that SEAL's 40 peacekeepers, trained for tariff enforcement and crowd control, and nothing resembling an actual fight, did not know what to do with 400 people who had stopped being afraid of them all at once. SEAL's garrison, 40 Concord peacekeepers, lightly armed, trained for crowd control and tariff enforcement, never once trained for an actual fight, because the Compliance Accord's entire premise was that they would never need to be, held the administrative compound for 11 minutes before the compound's own maintenance staff, human employees who had emptied SEAL's waste baskets and repaired his climate systems for a decade, opened the compound's rear service doors from the inside. The peacekeepers held the compound's central archive a few minutes longer, not out of any real hope of victory, but because their watch commander, a heavy-set officer named Dissin Carr who had spent 6 years enforcing SEAL's quotas without ever once losing sleep over them, genuinely believed until the final minute that reinforcement was coming. It was not. Carr surrendered his post at 05:25, not to Priya Solis, who by then had 6 other objectives to secure, but to a 60-year-old former schoolteacher named Owen Vance who simply walked up to him unarmed, took the sidearm out of his slack hand, and said, in a voice too tired to be angry anymore, "You're going to want to sit down somewhere and think very carefully about the next thing you say to anyone. Because in about 6 minutes the whole of Halcourt is going to hear exactly what you've been enforcing for 6 years, and I don't think you're going to like how it sounds out loud." By 05:31, Halcourt's tribute ledgers, every quota, every appeal denied, every adjustment for seasonal yield that had in fact starved 3 villages across 9 years to keep Concord shipping quotas intact, were broadcasting on every channel the resistance could seize, addressed not to SEAL and not to Earth, but to the 6 other tribute worlds under his administration, in a message that took 11 seconds to record, and that SEAL, watching it from a locked office with his own guards refusing to answer his door, understood immediately would end his career, even if it somehow did not end his life. He tried, for the next 40 minutes, to reach Fleet Marshal Odwin for military support. He could not. Nothing could reach anything. That was the whole of Longview's opening move, patient and total, not to defeat 3 separate powers in 3 separate battles,
but to make sure that for the first 4 critical hours, none of them could be sure the other 2 still existed at all. At 05:40, 6 hours and 20 minutes after Draeth's ultimatum and 1 hour and 49 minutes into Earth's own war, Talia Reyes landed her fighter, smoking from a hit she had taken across the port wing an hour earlier and flown on anyway, because Akafar's voice in her head would not let her do anything else, on the deck of the transport barge Second Chance, and was told, before she had even unstrapped, that Fireline Squadron's next assignment was not another fleet engagement. It was Corvale. "They've moved the timeline up," the barge's operations officer told her, not meeting her eyes, which was how she knew it was bad before he said the number. "Draeth's Spire is reporting increased activity at the mine consortiums holding pens. Command thinks he's accelerating the culling ahead of his own 6-hour mark. Could be spite. Could be he's realized his own comms are dead, and he's decided to make his point before someone tells him not to. How long? We don't know. Could be minutes. Could be he waits out the clock. Command wants a strike team in atmosphere over Corvale in under 20, and Fireline's the only squadron close enough to make that window." Talia's hands, strapping back into a cockpit that had a fresh crack running the length of its canopy, did not shake. She had promised herself 9 years ago in flight school that they never would, no matter what. It was the promise that had gotten her through the last 2 hours. It was the only promise she had left that mattered right now. "Then we make the window," she said. Grace Ake was waiting at the fighter bay when Talia crossed it, her own aircraft's hull still scorched from the counterflank an hour earlier, a fresh combat patch already slapped over the worst of the damage by a deck crew working faster than Talia had ever seen a deck crew work. "You're not doing this one without a wing," Ake said, before Talia could tell her to stand down and let a fresher pilot take the second slot. "I know what you're going to say. Say it anyway if you want, but I'm still climbing into that cockpit when you're done." Talia didn't waste the 30 seconds it would have taken to argue. "Then climb," she said, "and Ake fly like the Kestrel Belt Sim, not like tonight. Tonight's already cost us enough." Kessler, still grounded with a stabilizer the deck crew hadn't finished replacing, caught her arm as she passed his open cockpit. "Reyes, whatever's waiting at Corvale, you get your brother out. That's the whole mission as far as I'm concerned, doctrine be damned. Everything else is just the part that makes it possible." She did not have an answer that felt adequate to the 12,000 other people also waiting at Corvale, people who were not her brother, whose names she did not know, and who deserved exactly the same urgency she felt for Mateo and could not, in honesty, feel for strangers the same way no matter how hard she tried. She settled, in the end, for the only true thing she had. "I get everyone out, Kessler. Mateo's just the reason I won't stop until I do." The launch tube took her a second time that night, and this time the number on her canopy display read 3 hours, 41 minutes remaining on Draeth's original 6-hour clock, a number that meant almost nothing anymore, she understood, except as a measure of how much of the promise Earth had made to Corvale 22 years too late, it still had left to keep on time. Corvale Station sat on a wide gray plain under a sky the color of old iron. 12,000 residents behind a perimeter fence the Cindral Wardenry had built 8 years earlier, ostensibly to keep out native wildlife, in practice to keep in a population the Wardenry's actuarial tables classified as an asset awaiting collection. Mateo Reyes was 14 years old and had spent the last 5 hours and 50 minutes of his life in the schoolhouse basement with 200 other residents, listening to Warden-Commandant Draeth's compliance notice loop on a repeater every 11 minutes, and had by now stopped flinching at the sound of it, the way a person stops flinching at anything that repeats often enough, even the thing that is going to kill them. His grandmother, Lucia Reyes, 71 years old, sat beside him with her hand on his knee and did not look afraid, because she had buried a son at Meridian 22 years earlier and had promised herself, that day,
that she would never again let a Korrathi officer see fear on a Reyes face, whatever it cost her to fake its absence. "They'll come," she told him, for the fourth time in an hour, in the same tone she had used to say it the first time. "You don't know that." "I know your sister," Lucia said. "I know what she promised the day they took your father's memorial photo down at command because it made the officers uncomfortable to look at it. She was 11. She said, right in front of me, that one day it wouldn't be theirs to take down anymore. Your sister does not make promises she intends to break, Mijo. Neither does the fleet admiral who let her fly. Neither, I am starting to suspect, does anyone else in this whole quiet, patient country of ours." Around them, in a basement built to hold perhaps 80 people comfortably, and currently holding better than 200, a schoolteacher named Bettina Os moved quietly between rows of frightened children, keeping a head count she updated every few minutes, not because the number ever changed, but because counting gave her hands something to do besides shake. A boy younger than Mateo, 6 or 7, had stopped asking his mother when they could go home an hour ago, and had simply gone silent instead, which frightened Lucia more than any amount of crying would have. Mateo watched his grandmother watch the boy, and understood for the first time in his 14 years that the calm she wore like a coat was not the absence of fear. It was a decision she remade, visibly, every few minutes, the same way Bettina Os remade her head count, because the alternative, letting 200 people see exactly how frightened the oldest person in the room actually was, would have cost more than either of them could afford to spend. He thought about asking her again how she could be so sure someone would come, and did not, because he had already asked 4 times and had watched, each time, how much the answer cost her to give with a steady voice. Instead, he did the only thing that felt like it mattered. He took her hand, the way he had not done since he was younger than the silent boy across the room, and held it, and did not let go, and for the first time all afternoon, Lucia Reyes let herself lean just slightly into her grandson's shoulder. At 05:52, the repeater's 11-minute loop cut off mid-sentence. At 05:53, a new voice came over it, young, tired, unmistakably human, transmitting on the Wardenry's own compliance channel because Earth's forces had, 40 minutes earlier, seized that channel along with everything else, and were now using it to broadcast something that was not a compliance notice at all. It was Fleet Admiral Hale's voice, calm and grinding as gravel, addressed not to Corvale but past it, out across the whole of the Meridian reach. On every frequency the Cindral Wardenry, the Tribute Concord, and the Dominion fleet had ever used to talk to each other and could no longer use at all. "This is Fleet Admiral Osgood Hale, Terran Compact Forces. As of this transmission, the Dominion fleet's blockade of Earth has surrendered unconditional terms. As of this transmission, the Tribute Concord's occupation authority on Halcourt, Ashwell, and Dunmore has been dissolved by force and will not be reasserted. Warden-Commandant Draeth, you are, as of this hour, entirely alone. Release Corvale Station's population unharmed, and you may yet walk away from this. Do not, and you will not have the luxury of choosing how this ends." In the schoolhouse basement, no one cheered. It was too soon, and they had waited too long, and 22 years of restraint had taught even the children of Corvale not to trust good news until they could hold it. But Lucia Reyes squeezed her grandson's knee once hard and said, "There it is," in a voice that finally, after 5 hours and 53 minutes, allowed itself to shake. Fleet Marshal Oduin had surrendered 11 minutes earlier, at 05:41, not because his fleet was destroyed. It was not quite, though it stood at 58% of its opening strength and falling, but because a captured Dominion communications officer, patched through on a channel Earth's forces had rebuilt specifically to carry this one message, had shown him gun camera footage, time-stamped and unforgeable, of Yanar Seal's own administrative broadcast confessing 11 years of falsified tribute ledgers to 6 worlds, followed immediately by a second recording of Warden-Commandant Draeth's original ultimatum to Corvale, annotated with a simple, devastating addition: a live feed showing the Cindral Wardenry's own forward listening post. The one meant to be Draeth's eyes and ears on the human fleet's movements, dark and unresponsive on every channel for the last hour and 40 minutes. "You are being shown this," the transmission said in Hale's voice, "because your compliance accord assumed each of you would fight alone rather than be seen asking your rivals for help. We built this operation around that exact assumption for 22 years. It was correct. Marshal Oduin, your colleagues cannot save you because they do not know you are here, and even if they did, they have their own collapse to manage. You have 58% of a fleet and 0% of a reason left to keep spending it." Oduin stood on the deck of the Ashguard's Word for 9 seconds, the longest silence of his career, and the last one he would ever spend as a free commander of that ship, and then said the 2 words that would open the door for every capitulation that followed: "Cease fire." His tactical officer, a young man who had never once seen his marshal hesitate on anything, hesitated himself before relaying the order, as though it might not be real. "I said cease fire," Oduin repeated, and something in his voice, not defeat exactly, but the specific exhaustion of a competent man forced to recognize, all at once, that every assumption underneath his competence had just been proven wrong, made the officer move. At 05:41 local Meridian reach time, 1 hour and 50 minutes after the first missile left Earth orbit, the Dominion fleet's blockade of Earth stood down. It was the first of the 3. In the 40 minutes after Hale's broadcast reached Earth's own cities, carried, this time deliberately, on every public channel the Compact still controlled, because Cray had decided, in the same 4 seconds it took her to order Longview's execution, that a species that had spent 22 years being told to stay quiet had earned the right to hear its own war in real time. Something happened in 1,000 small places across the planet that no tactical report would ever fully capture. In a plaza in what had once been called Lisbon, a crowd that had gathered at first, simply because the public screens were showing something other than the usual compliance notices, grew from dozens to thousands in the space of 20 minutes, standing in near silence, listening to Fleet Marshal Oduin's ceasefire read aloud by a news anchor whose voice kept catching on words she had never expected to say on air. An old man near the front, who had lost a granddaughter at Meridian and had not spoken her name aloud in public in 19 years, said it now, quietly, to no one in particular, and the woman beside him, a stranger, took his hand and did not let go until the broadcast ended. In Corvale's home system, in a farm town 600 kilometers from the station itself, Talia's mother, who had buried a husband at Meridian and raised a daughter and a son largely alone in the years since, and who had not been told, because operational security forbade it, that her daughter was flying anything more dangerous than a routine patrol that night, heard the broadcast on a kitchen radio and sat down hard in a chair by the window, because she had recognized, in a single line about Fireline Squadron's opening strike, the exact unit designation her daughter had mentioned once, months earlier, in a letter she was not supposed to have sent and had sent anyway. She did not know yet whether her daughter was alive. She would not know for another 2 hours. But she sat by that window and listened to every word of every broadcast that followed, and when the report of Corvale's holding pen order being stopped finally came through, she wept for the first time since her husband's memorial and did not try to stop herself. None of it was celebration, not yet. 22 years of learning to distrust good news had left its mark on an entire species, and Earth cities that afternoon did not erupt into the kind of triumph an occupier might have predicted from a people finally free of one. They simply listened together in the particular hush of people who had waited a very long time to be allowed to hope out loud, and let the numbers 4 hours, 3 powers, 22 years settle into something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand the size of. Yanar Seal surrendered second, and unlike Oduin, he did not surrender because he had run out of fight. He surrendered because, at 05:50, standing in a locked office with a mob of his own former dockworkers on the other side of a door his own guards had opened for them, he realized with the particular clarity of a career administrator that there was, quite simply, no version of this ledger that balanced in his favor anymore. His 11 years of humane occupation, broadcast across 6 worlds in his own recorded voice, had cost him the one thing his entire method of rule had depended on: the quiet cooperation of people who no longer believed restraint administered at gunpoint deserved to be called restraint. His garrison had surrendered without him. His military support had gone silent an hour ago, and for all he knew, no longer existed, and the door was going to open whether he consented to it or not. He opened it himself, which was, in its own small way, the only dignity left to him. "I formally cede administrative authority over Halcourt, Ashwell, and Dunmore," he said, into a recorder held by a 19-year-old dockworker named Priya Solis, who had lost her older brother to a Concord adjustment for seasonal yield 4 years earlier, and did not lower the recorder an inch while he spoke. "Effective immediately, to the Terran Compact Provisional Authority, pending whatever process the Compact chooses to apply to me personally. I ask only that the terms extended to my administrative staff, who followed lawful orders, be as generous as circumstances allow." Priya Solis said nothing. She did not owe him an answer, and she did not give him one. But she did not shoot him either, which, given what 4 years of quiet fury might have earned him, was, Seal would later reflect, a mercy he had done nothing to deserve and would spend the rest of his long imprisonment trying to understand. At 05:52 local Meridian reach time, 2 hours and 1 minute into Earth's war, the Tribute Concord's occupation authority in the Meridian reach ceased to exist. It was the second of the 3. In the hardened room under the Rockies, Fleet Admiral Osgood Hale watched the second confirmation scroll across his display and allowed himself, for exactly the length of one breath, to feel something other than the flat calculating focus he had worn for 22 years. 2 powers down. 1 hour, 58 minutes gone. 33 names already lost, a number that would not stop climbing until the fighting did, and somewhere over a gray plain 600 kilometers past his reach, a 19-year-old. No, he corrected himself, 23. She had stopped being 19 a long time ago. It only felt otherwise because he still remembered teaching her to salute, flying toward a clock that had never once in his career waited for anyone to be ready. He had promised Daniel Reyes, in the last transmission he ever received from Meridian, that whatever came next would be worth what Meridian cost. He had spent 22 years building Longview on that promise, and he understood, watching the display, that he was about to find out, in the next hour, in real time, with Daniel's own daughter in the middle of it, whether a promise made to a dead man could actually be kept, or whether it had only ever been the shape grief took when it needed somewhere to put itself. "Corvale status," he said, and did not let his voice carry any of that into the open channel, because Hale had learned the same discipline he had taught Talia Reyes, a decade before he taught it to her. That calm was not a feeling. It was the last gift a commander had left to give the people depending on him to still have it. That left Draeth. Warden-Commandant Draeth had built his career on patience, on never raising his voice, on the specific cold discipline of a man who understood that fear administered evenly, and without exception was more efficient than fear administered with anger. He had read 400 compliance notices in that same even voice, and he had meant to read the culling order for Corvale Station in it too, on schedule, at the 6-hour mark, with the same unhurried professionalism he brought to everything. Hale's broadcast, naming him alone, changed that. Draeth had spent the last hour and 40 minutes in a command spire whose sensors reported nothing, whose relay was dead, whose forward listening post had gone silent without explanation, and whose marshal and overseer prefect colleagues, men he had never respected, had in fact quietly despised for their softness and their vanity, were now, apparently, both gone, dissolved, surrendered in the space of 11 minutes, by an enemy his own intelligence estimates had rated, as recently as 6 hours ago, structurally incapable of coordinated resistance. He had one weapon left that no human fleet could take from him by force, because it required no fleet at all. The culling order sitting queued in Corvale Station's holding pen control system, ready to execute the instant he gave the command. He gave that order to a junior wardenry officer named Sven Tauch, 26 years old by his own species reckoning, 4 years into a career he had chosen because the wardenry paid well and asked few questions, and who had, until that exact moment, never once been the one required to actually press the control that made a compliance directive real rather than theoretical. Tauch hesitated. It was a small hesitation, less than 2 seconds, the kind of pause that would never have appeared in any official record if the record of that night had gone the way every other compliance record in Draeth's 20-year career had gone. But Draeth heard it, the way a patient man hears the one thing that threatens his patience, and said, in the same even voice he had used to read 400 compliance notices, "Is there a difficulty, Officer Tauch?" "No, Warden-Commandant." Tauch's hand did not move to the control. "It's only the manifest was never confirmed. Compliance Directive 9 requires confirmation of noncompliance before. Compliance Directive 9 requires my authorization, which you now have. Execute the order, Officer Tauch, or I will find an officer who will, and you may explain to that officer's replacement why the delay on your record reads the way it will read." Tauch executed the order. He would spend the rest of his life, a considerably longer life than he expected to have, as it turned out, because the compact's tribunal process proved more interested in the men who gave orders than the men who flinched before obeying them, trying to explain to himself why 2 seconds of hesitation had not been enough to make him refuse outright, and never quite managing an answer he could live with easily. It was the closest anyone inside the Cindral Wardenry's chain of command came, that night, to questioning Draeth's authority before the fact rather than after it, and it changed nothing at all, because Draeth's authority, by then, did not depend on anyone questioning it. It depended only on no one having the power to stop him, and for exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds, that assumption held. At 0554, with Earth's covert fleet still 11 minutes out from Corvale's orbit, Draeth gave it. Talia Reyes heard the order relayed to her cockpit at 0555, not the order itself, which the Wardenry had transmitted on an internal frequency Earth's forces had not yet cracked, but the desperate, garbled warning that came a half-second later from an intelligence officer aboard Second Chance who had been listening to exactly that frequency for the last 3 hours, waiting for exactly this. "Fireline, be advised, holding pen control system just received an execute command. We do not have a decrypt, we do not know the trigger delay, get there. Get there now." She did not answer. There was nothing to say that would get her there faster than simply flying. Corvale's atmosphere came up fast and gray and hostile, her fighter screaming through a reentry corridor that Longview's planners had never modeled for a combat descent this steep, alarms across her console lighting in sequence as her airframe protested angles it was not built for. She did not slow down. She had told her brother's grandmother nothing in 12 years that she did not intend to keep, and she was not going to start with the one promise that mattered. The holding pen control station sat in a low gray building at the edge of the perimeter fence, staffed by 6 wardenry technicians who had spent the last hour listening to a silence they did not understand and were, when Talia's fighter put down hard on the access road outside their door, still arguing among themselves about whether the execute order Draeth had transmitted 11 minutes earlier was even still valid. Given that no one could confirm the Warden-Commandant himself, was still in command of anything. She did not give them time to finish arguing. 2 members of Longview's ground element had beaten her there by 90 seconds, dropped from a stealth insertion pod that had spent the last 3 hours holding station in Corvale's upper atmosphere waiting for exactly this contingency. Sergeant Dune Akoy, 34, who had spent 9 years training for a mission he had been told might never come, and Corporal Inez Vasquez, 26, whose only instruction from Longview's planners had been to memorize the internal schematics of every Wardenry holding pen control model in current service, a task she had completed so thoroughly that she could, if asked, have drawn the wiring diagram of the exact panel now in front of her from memory alone. "Sergeant, we have 4 minutes on the trigger and a decrypt that isn't finished," Vasquez said, already elbow-deep in an access panel, her voice tight but not panicked, because panic, like everything else about this operation, had been trained out of her over 9 long years. "I need the manual override, and I need it without tripping the tamper lock, and I have never done this on a live system before, only on a mock-up." "Then do it like the mock-up," Akoy said, covering the room's second entrance with a weapon he had not yet needed to fire. "It doesn't know the difference." Talia's fighter came down on the access road outside hard enough to crack a landing strut, and she was through the building's outer door 11 seconds later, into a room where 6 Wardenry technicians were still arguing about whether an order from a Warden-Commandant who might no longer command anything was still an order worth following. One of them reached for a sidearm holstered at his hip, a reflex, more than a decision, the reflex of a man who had never in his career needed to actually use the weapon and had never imagined the day he would have to choose in under a second whether to. Talia's decision took less time than his. She put him down before his hand cleared the holster and did not look at him again, because looking would cost time Vasquez did not have. The other 5 put their hands up before she had to decide about any of them. 90 seconds, Vasquez said, not looking up. "I need 90 seconds in total quiet." She did not get total quiet. What she got was Akoy holding the second door against a Wardenry security response that arrived 40 seconds later and outnumbered him 4-1, and Talia dividing her attention, unbearably, between the countdown on the panel and the sound of gunfire in the corridor behind her, until the moment, 9 seconds before the trigger would have executed, that Vasquez said, in a voice gone suddenly, fiercely calm, "Got it," and the number on the panel simply stopped. What happened next was not, afterward, a story Talia told cleanly, even to herself. It took 90 seconds. It involved a door that did not open the way she expected, a technician who reached for a weapon and a technician who did not, and a decision, hers, alone, made in under a second, the kind of decision 9 years of training existed to prepare a person for and never quite could, about which one to trust with her life and which one not to. What mattered afterward was the number on the control panel, a trigger sequence with 4 minutes and 11 seconds still remaining on its countdown when her hand found the manual override. Longview's intelligence had spent 3 years mapping this exact model of Wardenry hardware to locate, and stopped it with 9 seconds to spare on a decrypt her own technical officer had finished, breathless, over the comm, 11 seconds before she needed it. She did not celebrate. She had learned in the last 2 hours that celebration cost time she did not have. She simply opened the holding pen's outer gate, walked through it into a compound full of 12,000 people who had spent 5 hours and 59 minutes believing they might not see the far side of that number, and said, into a comm channel patched to every speaker in Corvale Station, in a voice she kept as flat and steady as she could make it, because Akafor had taught her that steady was a discipline, and this, finally, was the moment that discipline had been for. "This is Lieutenant Talia Reyes, Terran Compact Forces. The holding order is stopped. You're safe." Warden-Commandant Draeth no longer has the authority to give that command, and in about 4 minutes, he isn't going to have the authority to give any command at all. She was closer to right than she knew. Draeth, watching his own control system's kill switch flip from a remote feed in the command spire, watching, in real time, 4 minutes and 2 seconds of a countdown he had ordered evaporate under a single human officer's hand. Understood. In the specific, total way, a patient man understands the exact moment his patience has stopped being a virtue and become simply the last thing he has left, that there was no version of the next hour that ended with him still holding anything. His garrison, 60 Wardenry enforcers who had trained for years to suppress an unarmed population and had never once drilled against an opposed military assault, held the spire's outer defenses for 6 minutes against a strike team that Longview's planners had rehearsed this exact objective against 100 times in simulation on a mock-up built from smuggled architectural drawings 9 years old. Draeth surrendered at 06:14 local Meridian reach time, 2 hours and 23 minutes into Earth's war, 4 hours and 46 minutes since his own ultimatum, not because he believed in mercy, and not because he had run out of ammunition, though he nearly had, but because a strike team leader half his age put a rifle 4 inches from his face and said, with a steadiness that unsettled him far more than shouting would have, "You have one thing left worth more than your life. Warden-Commandant, it's information. You give it to us and you get a trial. You don't, and we've already won without you, so it costs us nothing either way. Choose fast." He chose fast. Sven Tauch, standing under guard in the corridor outside, heard the surrender through the wall and felt, for the first time since a control panel's countdown had stopped under a stranger's hand, something that was not quite relief and not quite shame, but close enough to both that he did not try to name it. He would spend the coming tribunal answering for 2 seconds of hesitation that had not been enough. He understood, even then, that 2 seconds of hesitation was still more than Draeth had ever once allowed himself in 20 years, and that the difference, small as it looked on paper, was the only thing standing between the sentence he would eventually receive and the one his warden-commandant would. At 06:41 local Meridian reach time, 4 hours and 50 minutes after the first catapult fired, First Speaker Cray stood in the same hardened room under the Rockies and received, in the space of 9 minutes, 3 confirmations that would end that room's 22 years of quiet, grinding patience. The Dominion Fleet's formal ceasefire, signed by Fleet Marshal Oduin's own hand. The Tribute Concord's dissolution, broadcast in Yanner Seal's own recorded voice to 6 worlds that had never once heard an occupying administrator admit fault before, and a field report from Corvale Station confirming 12,000 residents alive, unharmed, and, as of 06:19, no longer behind any fence the Cindral Wardenry had built. 3 powers, 4 hours and 50 minutes. Every enemy the Compliance Accord had ever sent to enforce its terms on Earth had surrendered within the same single afternoon, most of them without ever learning, until the surrender itself, that the others had already fallen. Cray did not celebrate either. She had learned the same lesson everyone in that room had learned 22 years earlier, at Meridian, and relearned in smaller doses every year since, that a war this fast did not mean a war this cheap. 41 pilots had launched from Earth orbit that morning. 33 had come home. Idris Akhafer's name would go up on a memorial wall beside 400 others from the last 2 decades, and no surrender, however total, would take it back down. "Get me the casualty list," she said quietly to the aide beside her. "All of it, every name. I want to read everyone before I say a single word to the press." It took her 40 minutes to read all 33 names, in a small side room with the door closed and no aide present, because she had promised herself, on the day she signed the order to activate Longview, that she would never let herself announce a victory to the public before she had privately grieved its cost in full, name by name, the way Meridian's dead had never been grieved by any authority with the power to have prevented their deaths in the first place. Idris Akhafer's name was 7th on the list. She read it twice. When she finally stood to address the compact, she did not lead with the surrender terms, though the terms were historic, and she did not lead with the casualty count, though the country deserved to hear it from her rather than from a broadcast. She led with a single sentence, quiet and unadorned, that would be carved within the year into the base of a memorial wall bearing 33 names. Today we did not become who they always said we would become if we ever stopped being patient. We simply stopped being quiet, and it turns out those were never the same thing at all. On Korath Prime, 40 light days from a system that had, until that morning, occupied a single unremarkable line item in a compliance ledger 311 years old, Emperor Vale Sarenth received the consolidated report at what would have been, in Meridian Reach local time, roughly the 5th hour of Earth's war, though the light carrying the news would not physically arrive at the Onyx throne for weeks. An irony that would not be lost on the court historian, Alis Vor. Tasked with compiling the official record, who noted, in the private journal she was not supposed to keep, that the Empire had spent 3 centuries treating distance as a kind of safety, and had just learned. In the space of a single afternoon, it would not even hear about for a month. That distance had never protected it from anything at all. The report, when it finally reached the throne, was 9 words long, appended to the Compliance Accord's official file on the Meridian Reach, and it was those 9 words, more than any battle report, more than any casualty count, that the Chorus Network, the Empire's own propaganda relay, seized and repurposed for exactly 9 minutes by a compact communications team, who understood better than anyone alive what it meant to make an empire's own instruments carry a message it had never chosen to send broadcast to every subjugated world under Korrathi rule, time-stamped, unforgeable, impossible to retract. 3 enforcement powers committed. 3 enforcement powers surrendered. Elapsed time, 4 hours 50 minutes. It reached 1,000 worlds before the throne could suppress a single relay. On some of them, tribute officials quietly deleted the broadcast from public record within the hour. On others, the ones with their own quiet grievances, their own 22-year silences, their own water towers painted with names and occupying power had ordered removed, someone made sure a copy survived. Emperor Vale Sarenth read the 9-word summary twice, standing alone on the Onyx throne's private terrace, weeks removed by then from an afternoon that had already finished happening long before the news of it reached him. He was an old man by his species' reckoning, 3 centuries into a reign that had absorbed 6 new tribute worlds without ever once requiring his personal attention, and he found, standing there with the report in his hand, that he did not have a procedure for this either, not fury, not quite, and not fear, but something closer to the specific vertigo of a man discovering that a wall he had never bothered to test had, in fact, never been load-bearing at all. "Summon the Compliance Accord's drafting committee," he said, finally, to the aide waiting at a respectful distance. "I want to know which of them believed dividing the Meridian Reach's enforcement into 3 separate commands was a safeguard against collusion, and I want to know whether any of them ever once modeled what would happen if the humans simply refused to collude with anyone, including us." The aide did not have an answer. Neither, in the weeks that followed, did the drafting committee, most of whom had been dead for over a century, their successors having inherited the Compliance Accord structure the way an heir inherits a house without ever checking its foundations. Alis Vor, recording the exchange for the official archive, added a private line to her own journal that night, one she suspected, correctly, as it happened, that she would still be asked about decades later, when other subject worlds began asking their own quiet questions about their own quiet silences. "We built an empire on the assumption that patience was a permanent condition. We have just watched an entire species demonstrate, in under 5 hours, that patience is a decision, and decisions can be unmade the instant the reason for making them stops being worth the cost. I do not know how many other worlds in the Reach are doing that same arithmetic tonight. I suspect the throne does not want to know either, which is, I think, its own kind of answer. She was right to suspect it. It would be 4 more years before the throne allowed her journal to be read by anyone outside, the Compliance Accord's own vetted historians, and longer still before anyone outside, the Korrathi Imperium's core worlds understood exactly how many of them had already begun. On a tribute world called Ashkelon, 400 light-years from Earth and utterly unconnected to the Meridian reach by anything but the same chorus network that governed them both, an assay-cast worker named Thresk, who had spent years quietly documenting, in his own private ledgers, every doctrinal condemnation he had ever been ordered to perform. Watched the 9-word summary scroll across a public screen in a market square he had crossed 10,000 times without ever once expecting it to show him anything but tribute notices and compliance schedules. He read it 3 times. He did not know the names Oduin, Seal, or Draeth, and would not learn them until years later, when the full record was finally declassified. But he understood the shape of it immediately, the way anyone who has spent a lifetime being told a thing is permanent understands, all at once, the specific vertigo of watching it prove otherwise, and he found himself standing very still in the middle of the square for a long moment, doing arithmetic he had never quite let himself do out loud. He was not the only one. Across 1,000 worlds the Chorus network reached without ever intending to carry a message like this one. The same 9 words did the same quiet work in the same few minutes. Not inciting revolt, not yet, not anywhere, but planting a fact that no amount of imperial suppression could fully unplant afterward. That the Compliance Accord's oldest and most fundamental assumption, the one every other assumption in the Empire's 140-year architecture of control ultimately rested on, had a name now, and the name was simply this. It had never actually been tested until the day it broke. Talia found her brother 40 minutes after the gate opened, in a crowd of people still blinking in a gray daylight they had not expected to see again. And she did not run to him, because running would have meant putting down the discipline that had kept her alive for the last 5 hours, and she was not ready to put it down yet. She walked. He saw her first, a scorched flight suit, a crack running the length of a helmet she had not bothered to take off, a face that looked, for just a moment, exactly as young as it actually was, and he ran to her instead, which was allowed, because he was 14 and had never promised anyone he wouldn't. Their grandmother reached them a moment later, moving slower, her hand pressed once, hard, against Talia's cheek, the way she had done every single time Talia had come home from something that could have killed her, going back to flight school graduation. "You're late," Lucia said, and her voice finally, after everything, allowed itself to break. "I know," Talia said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, be alive. That's all I ever asked for." She looked past her granddaughter, out toward the perimeter fence still standing, gate open, its purpose gone. "Is it over?" Talia thought about Akafar's voice cutting off mid-sentence over an open comm. She thought about 33 fighters landing and 8 that never would. She thought about a war that had taken 4 hours and 50 minutes to win and 22 years to prepare, and about how neither of those numbers, said out loud, would ever capture what either one had actually cost. "The fighting's over," she said, which was true, and which was also, she understood even as she said it, not quite the same thing as being finished. The rest of it we're going to be dealing with for a long time, but nobody's coming for you tonight, Mateo. Not tonight. Not any night after this one, not like they used to. He held on to her, and she let him, and for the first time in 5 hours she let her hands shake, just slightly, just for a moment, in a place where no one watching would ever call it anything but human. Lucia Reyes looked past them both, once more, at the water tower rising over the station's low rooftops, the one with the Reyes name still painted on it, in defiance of an order given 8 years earlier by an officer who no longer had any authority to give orders on Corvale at all, or anywhere else in the Meridian reach. She had painted over that order herself, quietly, at night, with a can of paint she had kept hidden for exactly that purpose since the day the order was issued, and she had never told either of her grandchildren how many times, over 8 years, she had stood in that spot at dawn half expecting a wardenry patrol to make her paint it out again. No patrol was coming. She understood that now, standing in the gray daylight with her grandson's arms still around her granddaughter's shoulders, in the specific, unhurried way that a person understands a fact only after they have stopped needing to brace against its opposite. "Your father would have liked this," she said, echoing, without knowing she echoed it, the last thing Idris Akafir had ever said to Talia over an open comm. Not the fighting. He never liked the fighting. He would have liked this part right here, right now, the part where nobody has to run anymore. Talia did not correct her, and did not tell her, not yet, about Akafir, or about the 33 names that would go up on a wall she had not yet seen. There would be time for that. There would, for the first time in 22 years, simply be time. Behind her, in the gray Corvale sky, a compact transport banked low over the station, its running lights steady, unhurried, in no rush at all anymore, and somewhere over the horizon a war that had lasted less than 5 hours and had been 22 years in the waiting quietly, finally, without a single word of celebration from anyone who had actually fought it, came to an end.